Acoustic Acoustic. I love the music. And welcome back to Hanging with History, Season 1, That Miracle That Happened, That One Time. And this is Episode 40, James Stewart, Part 1, The Wisest Fool. And this week we're joined by Valkyrie. She's one of my Norwegian cousins. You might remember her from the Magna Carta episode, where her wit and wisdom and kindness really came through. She started out a bit skeptical about my claims that Magna Carta represents a fantastic example of the human ability to construct new social realities from almost nothing, and that it's one of the most notable big steps towards the miracle. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England at the death of Elizabeth in 1603, he took over a country that had undergone a huge amount of change. The nobility were no longer the richest group in society. Huge transfers of landed property had been taking place, and the gentry were now the richest and most powerful class by far. Part of this was the deliberate Tudor policy of keeping the nobility in check. Elizabeth kept the lords small. It was said that the commons, dominated by gentry, could buy the House of Lords 3 times over. This is a situation that was also true in the United Provinces and to a lesser extent Denmark, but nowhere else. At this time, 1603, the nobility in Europe were the most powerful group by a large margin, more powerful than the kings even, with just a few notable exceptions. And let's talk a little about how the podcast is going to handle this period leading up to the Civil War. First, I should repeat that the English Civil War was a world epical event. That might not be immediately obvious to you. I mean, if I was to say that about the American Civil War, you'd probably nod. Yes, sure, it created the stronger federal government, abolition of slavery, American industrialization, cultural victory of Quaker/Puritan culture over Cavalier culture, shaped the American future, and America shaped the world. Easy. Now, the English Civil War is not much understood outside England, though. They cut off the head of a divine monarch and then broke the whole kingship thing by not having another king. It did not lead immediately and permanently to the current parliamentary government, where the crown is subservient to the legislature, and indeed the executive function becomes dependent upon the legislature. But it did lead to an acceleration of the growth of widespread wealth and commercial power over traditional landed power. In other words, it was a large step towards the miracle. But even more, in light of our theme that the miracle is an n=1 event, and when I say n=1, the only one that happened in the whole of human history, I don't mean to merely emphasize the inapplicability of traditional statistics, which is usually the case when the phrase n=1 is used, by me also. No, right now I mean to highlight the absence of a negative. This heightens the importance of the event instead of diminishing it. After the convulsions of the Civil War, England could easily have gone down a very dark path and not had the miracle at all. Remember that all societies have failed of their promise up to now. Every society screwed it up and went the wrong way. And that sounds harsh and is certainly considered bad taste and not the way history's done these days. But I stand here pointing at the miracle and say you would probably not even be alive without it. In certain ways, most of the good things and the good people we have now depended on it. But England did not go the wrong way, and that eucatastrophe is what we are investigating. And go back to Episode 1 if you don't know what a eucatastrophe is. Hint, it's a made-up word by Tolkien.
No, you should explain new terms or terms you use idiosyncratically. It's not fair to the listener otherwise.
Yes, it's true I move pretty fast and don't revisit intellectual territory much. I know a lot of listeners are really intelligent and consume informational content quickly and prefer that. But that's probably not a universal preference.
And saying go back to episode 1 sounds dismissive. Plus the early episodes were not as good in many ways.
Ouch, that hurts. But it hurts because it's true. Okay, a eucatastrophe is just like a catastrophe, but a good catastrophe, a wonderful catastrophe, unexpected, maybe sudden, but always out of the blue, and only careful study lets you understand how it came about. It's catastrophe with the Greek prefix eu. EU in front to indicate good and right. Okay? So Elizabeth was succeeded peacefully by a new dynasty, the Stuarts of Scotland, who would somehow lose their grip on power and start a civil war, and then be restored to power in 1660 after 19 years out of power, and then lose everything again in 1688 in the Glorious Revolution. So how did the Stuarts lose the respect and awe, the traditional deference that the Tudor monarchs built up? How did they blow it? They essentially tried to create an absolute monarchy like the one in Spain, like the one evolving in France, and would succeed in France, and would succeed in Austria, Denmark, Sweden, and Prussia as well. It didn't work in England, not through lack of trying, though. They tried very deliberately, and just when it looked like succeeding, the attempt failed, twice. Obviously, England was different enough, perhaps just barely different enough, to reject the matrix of absolute monarchy that otherwise successfully infected Europe in the 17th century.
What do you mean, matrix of absolute monarchy?
In this case, the pattern of absolute monarchy, the consolidation of power, national and local, into a royal administration, a central government that previously had to share power with strong local/provincial power bases, or noble power, or merchant/burgher power. When the first Stuart attempt at absolute power failed, it ended in civil war. And we're going to look at 4 good, possible, credible causes of the English Civil War, and add a minor fifth as well. I'll list them out now, and we'll go deeper later. And we'll have several episodes of narrative history to follow. 1. The religious element. Elizabeth was God's favorite. Everyone agreed. We could take a simplistic approach. God did not like the Stuarts and punish them for where they were trying to take the country. The military activities of the Stuarts were to be great failures. God's favor was withdrawn in an obvious way. And perhaps the English never really accepted Christ in their hearts, or perhaps they really worshiped the god of war in the dark places of their secret hearts, or maybe just as an aspect of God. I mean, could this be true while at the same time they were better Christians, seemingly, than everyone else? Or could we say that the Protestant cause and English patriotism were so bound up together that the Catholicizing tendencies of the Stuart kings doomed them? And we know religious considerations were paramount to the Presbyterian Scots who caused the crisis in 1639. It was, quite specifically, a religious issue that led directly to the Civil War. And there's a great deal to be said for this line of attack in the big picture, since in the end, with the accession of George I in 1714, principle of monarchy was put below the principle of a Protestant-ruled Britain, by Protestants and for Protestants. Historians today think this backwards-looking approach is wrong and dangerous and cheating, bad history, which makes me laugh because that is in fact the ostensible purpose of this podcast. But I don't need to totally cross that line. And you can tell, however, that I'm not going to totally lean into explanation number 1, else why would I mention 5 explanations? Which is a good segue into 2, the constitutional issue. The Stuarts tried to establish divine right, absolute monarchy in a country which had a vague concept of something called Magna Carta, which had a parliament and common law, and rule by local JPs that were not fond of central government interference. And hey, I got rights, man. And maybe this aim of absolute monarchy simply could not coexist with a framework in which people believed they had rights. I've already said this, so probably I believe there's something there. And once people get to the point of being willing to defend their rights with violence, perhaps this constitutional issue was crucial. 3. The failure of kingship. Kings are there to lead the country and protect its inhabitants, citizens, the people of the nation, however it's appropriate to express it. When leaders fail at this, as arguably they did in the 1630s, with arbitrary taxation, seizure of property, arbitrary arrest, suppression of freedom of speech, and more, they become illegitimate, not least according to Augustine, which all educated Englishmen were aware of, there's also a feeling of natural justice violated when the king is the source of predation on the people. The metaphysical point of a king is the establishment of justice. The monopolies we've been talking about, the arbitrary injustices of the Court of Wards, the arbitrary taxation, the very erosion of the social hierarchy. And finally, John Locke came along to explain all this in terms the people of the late 17th century could understand and embrace. 4. Maybe Charles I, the one who lost his head, was somehow so deeply bad as a king that he kind of killed the party buzz or ruined the idea for everyone. Psychoanalyzing from a distance is almost always a sign of deep stupidity or partisanship so strong it is blinding. So I'm not going to put a name on it, but Charles I was impossible to deal with. Even sober, staid, respectable historians will say things like he was impossible to negotiate with. How could you negotiate with someone like this? And basically, their point was that as various parties tried to work out reasonably long-term agreements for settling the government of the country and establishing lasting peace, Charles would just be looking for a way to blank the other party in the ass. Thus, he was impossible to negotiate with, in the sense of ever reaching an agreement that he would keep. Thus, you could not negotiate with him. Therefore, you had to chop his fool head off. This one sounds shaky, but so much English history has been driven by the fear of high officials losing their heads. I mean, for example, the whole affair of the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Anyway, I'm not dismissing this possibility. 5. 5 is one you'll seldom hear from respectable historians, so maybe it's only a factor of covariance with the other 4. But the very smartest, like Christopher Hill, do bring it up. And it is somewhat like 4, except maybe Parliament in 1640 was so bad that it was impossible to work with. English historians don't like blaming Parliament for some reason. Maybe it weakens other arguments, maybe there's a subtle rooting interest. But I was quite struck by Thomas Wentworth. He was a parliamentary leader of the opposition to Charles I in the 1628 Parliament. And he went over to the king's side with the remark that Parliament was too fractious, dedicated to opposing rather than governing, in a positive, practical sense. Emotionally motivated, mindless opposition seems to be everywhere. And then when you look at what Parliament was actually doing, you see some justice in Wentworth's position. And this one seems to deserve some consideration as a contributing factor. And 6, I know I said there were only 4 with a minor 5th, but with 6, we could take a narrow view and just focus on the failure of the oppressive apparatus to keep the king in power. And this is an interesting part in all revolutions. Often revolutions are prevented this way. But once we acknowledge the failure, we're back to the other reasons. So I think we'll set it aside.
Yes, number 6 is also a little bit creepy, don't you think? Religion, constitutional issues, which are about status, power, and money. Those sound more likely to be fruitful. Specifics about one single person at this remove of time, your number 4, almost 400 years, have to be considered uncertain.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Let's spend some time on the narrative of the pre-Civil War period over the next few episodes and see where we land. As usual, listeners, let me know your reactions. Elizabeth dies and James I slowly moves south because he does not want to arrive until after Elizabeth's funeral. He was in for a few rude surprises as he moved south. I've mentioned his embarrassment when he learned that he couldn't even order a pickpocket to be executed on the spot. He was also embarrassed by the royal revenue, which was insufficient to maintain royal government, even after peace with Spain. Elizabeth had been living very modestly by royal standards and still had to sell royal land every couple years to keep going. And Scotland was a poor country at the time, dominated by Presbyterian clergy that felt very free to hector even their king, and a nobility that some historians term mafia-like. England was far richer, but the crown was not necessarily so. This would come as a great surprise. James I and his son and successor Charles I are major figures in the P equals NP challenge of history. Do vast forces of historical inevitability, surging social changes, technological change, and new ideas move history along, or is it a few influential individuals making this choice or that, which changes the world? It's hard to deny the impact on history of the first two Stuart kings, who had somehow managed to throw away the love, awe, and respect the English had for their kings. Often historians give us a story of monumentally bad judgment and failure that turned history on its head. And my cause for was Charles I possibly being such a bad king that he couldn't be allowed to live. But, well, I'm not so sure. I mean, this has not ever been specifically stated in my pile of Stuart histories, but I think it's important that John Fox's Book of Martyrs, that book that Drake carried everywhere and was most Englishmen's introduction to history, that book had Bloody Mary I, the monarch, as a villain, although mostly Spanish villains. Opposing her and the crown for reason of religion was the most noble of actions. Heroism as great as heroism in battle with Spain or France. So I think the seed was planted in Mary's time, and the idea that one could oppose a monarch, one should oppose a monarch for good reason, and indeed it was a sacred duty to oppose a monarch at times. And where else in the world did the idea of opposing a monarch as a sacred duty come to you with your breakfast?
Why are you mentioning breakfast? Are trying to say keepers reminded them to oppose unjust kings?
Breakfast as a metaphor for childhood, one of the first things you learn. And with that idea sitting out there in the minds of the English, it would not perhaps be so hard to imagine that the English would resist absolute monarchy, once they could see it for the tyranny it was. And with the growth of the idea of the divine right of kings, as France, Denmark, Sweden, Catholic and Protestant, all tended to this direction. Kings are kings by divine right, so what limits could nobles and commons place upon royal authority? That's the kind of question that might well have to be settled in blood. A forceful artistic expression of this is found in Copenhagen today at the Rosenborg Castle, right in the middle of the city. The castle grounds are beautiful, with statues every few yards, and one of them is a great expression of this mood, moment, and movement toward royal power. It shows a lion which has knocked down a horse and has begun to devour the poor beast. The lion has a remarkable human-like face, and the horse is overwhelmed with terror. The statue symbolizes the victory of royal power, the lion over the nobility, the horse. In Denmark, the kings would achieve their domination over the nobles just about the time Charles II and his brother James II were trying to establish the royal supremacy. And their grandfather, James I of England, who we're talking about now, and James VI of Scotland, was not in any way a stupid man. And in the Scottish context, he was a clever politician. He even got bishops re-established in the Scottish Kirk in the teeth of Presbyterian opposition. And remember that Presbyterian intellectuals took seriously Calvinist ideas of church governance and organization, and wanted a flat structure in religion based on how they understood early church structure.
Presbyterian church structure is very democratic, in one sense only. Your status as a member of the elect or not is infinitely more important than any other status like noble or humble parents. Of course, kings can't stand this.
Right. Presbyterian ministers were known to tell James to his face that he was nothing more than a plain vessel of God, just as they were, as stable boys and scullery maids are, and this might have been very confusing to a young man trying to learn how to be a king and be himself. Presbyterians and Puritans generally emphasized literacy and intellectual egalitarianism. Every person is thought to have the capacity to understand Scripture and should learn to read and try to interpret what they read. All this thinking for yourself, it's bound to lead to trouble. But intellect, divorced from a context rooted in reality, is often not very useful. James wrote 3 books. Yes, he did 3. Impressive for a king. You'd think he would have other things to do. The first one was about witchcraft. So, you see, James did one romantic thing. Well, one romantic heterosexual thing. He was very romantic in his homosexual side all his life. Although I'll just mention once that our sexual categories these days are probably not a great fit for the 17th century, and people resist being categorized. Yudkowsky's The Categories Are Made for Man, Not Man for the Categories is a great essay on Less Wrong. Anyway, James was very openly affectionate to his favorites. A public touching, stroking of the face and hands. He defended his relationship with his second favorite, George Villiers, to his royal council in an interestingly blasphemous way. Jesus had his John, and I have my George. Anyway, one romantic thing. James was king in 1588 and 22 years old. He saw a portrait of Princess Anne of Denmark, and according to Alan Massey, convinced himself that he was in love with her. By the way, while I rely a lot on Peter Ackroyd for the narrative, Alan Massey, who is most famous as a novelist, has a really good book, The Royal Stuarts, where I guess you could say he deploys the skills of a novelist, getting inside the heads of the characters. It's both very enjoyable and a new kind of insight. You don't even have to agree with all of it. Anyway, back to Anne, Princess of Denmark. Her father, the King of Denmark, was having trouble coming up with the dowry. And James said, "She is my love, not a thing of merchandise, and I would take her without dowry." When she sailed from Denmark to Scotland, her little fleet was forced by storm to take refuge in Norway, which was part of Denmark back then. Well, James got his own ships together and went to her rescue. And that was his grand gesture. They married and hobnobbed with Tycho Brahe, the same astronomer from our Birth of Science episodes. And this leads to his contact with witches. When Anne's fleet was interrupted by storm, the Danish admiral claimed the storm had been brewed by witches. Well, when the royal couple got back to Scotland, a coven of witches was discovered in North Berwick. And sure enough, they did confess to sending the storm and consorting with demons. And we already talked about what torturers could get women to confess to. The witches claimed that a member of their coven was one of James's cousins, the Lord Admiral of Scotland. Because who better than the Lord Admiral to ask Satan to attack a fleet with a storm? Well, this cousin was like James, a grandson of James V, so of course he was never tortured, just imprisoned. And then he went wild. He escaped from prison, and a few weeks later came back to try to kidnap or kill James. And 2 years later, tried it again. Apparently, he survived that attempted coup as well, and escaped to Italy, where it was said that he lived as a fortune teller in Milan for a couple decades. So maybe he really was a witch. Anyway, the witches of Berwick got James interested enough that his first book was on demonology. So there you go, intellect, poorly directed. He did later decide that witchcraft was mostly delusion. And by the way, Anne had 7 children, 3 of which survived into adulthood, so James was able in that department. Historians don't think he was ever unfaithful to her, with the woman, and certainly there were no illegitimate children around. In contrast, his 2 grandsons had something like 15 illegitimate children. Later in life, Anne converted to Catholicism, and James did not seem pleased about it, but he tolerated it. So James crowned in London King of England as James I. So now he was James VI of Scotland and James I of England. And they didn't stay to celebrate after the coronation, since that was a plague year in London, and they left for the country immediately, although not before drooling over the crown jewels in Whitehall. He quickly got the peace with Spain signed, which was unpopular. But soon after, on November 5th, 1605, a Jesuit-led plot to blow up commons, lords, and the king with gunpowder in a cellar under Parliament was discovered, and this is still celebrated annually as that weird day in November when the English have a fireworks display, Guy Fawkes Night. Anyway, this seemed to show divine favor, and divine favor helps make you popular. Popularity isn't essential for a king, however. Respect and awe is. And right at James' core was a kind of frivolousness, a lack of seriousness and competence. Despite the fact that James was well educated in the medieval scholastic way, and obviously intelligent with a good vocabulary. Have you ever met someone like this? They carry themselves around as a smart person and act like they're the intellectual equal of even the best. Use a lot of big words, but in the end can't seem to make good decisions and live their lives in a fairly ridiculous manner. Well, that was James I. A king needs to be a leader, and leadership is just not something everyone has. Back in the economic fallacy episodes 36 and 37, we discussed start sheds, and that absurd happening occurred under James I. All those dead pigs. What a shame. And by the way, James supposedly had a phobia about pigs himself, and I wonder if that was the inspiration for Tom Sharp, the English satirist, to give a couple of his villains pig phobias. Regardless, it was James who pretended to yield to his subjects' complaints about how monopolies were injurious to the poor, but actually encouraged companies and corporations to have all the monopolies. By the same reasoning that kings want bishops to control religion, which we covered there are relatively few and you can threaten them and or shake them down for cash, it makes kings prefer dealing with companies. So much easier to tax, and again, shake down for forced loans. You can place your nominees on their boards and control them easier. They can protect their own merchant fleets overseas, and Francis Bacon, who actually worked in James's government, said trading in companies is agreeable to a monarchy, free trade to a republic.
Francis Bacon? That's surprising. He is known for establishing the concept of deliberate pursuit of science and discovery. All the scientists later in the century idolized his works.
Yeah, he was in government, a Puritan, as were so many of the great early scientists.
Was he any good in government?
Well, some historians say James did not like speaking to him because it made clear the limits of James' intellect and education. Others that he gave good advice but was not listened to. He seems to have been well thought of by most. He didn't like monopolies. He was impeached, but it seemed to be just court politics, nothing in it. Anyway, it never detracted from his later reputation.
And you say he was a Puritan, a religious zealot. Funny thing for someone credited with the foundation of modern science.
A Puritan is an individualist. It comes at least partially from the idea that scriptures were to be treated as a serious source of truth, to be investigated and discovered, a deep reading rather than a simplistic one.
Why should Puritans be individualists when they believe in predestination? And how can a biblical literalist be an intellectual?
Okay, well, I see we need an episode on this. For now, let's say that individualism and science as we understand it would be impossible without Puritans. So the important thing is the analysis of the Bible, emphasis on analysis and interpretation, and the concomitant idea that you can analyze even the Bible, and that this is the most important thing you can do. Everything is subject to the mind. When they appeal to Scripture, they're not appealing to Scripture, which is a dead thing. They're appealing to their own analysis or interpretation. The most important thing of all happens between your ears. The conclusion they came to is that the universe was law-abiding. Therefore, go out and discover the laws. If that is your calling, you should work hard to do so. Whatever your calling, you have an absolute duty to it. You can, whoever you are, you must follow your calling. No other human, however exalted, has a right to interfere in what you are called to do. That is both individualist and intellectual, albeit from a spiritual path. This particular move, or trick, or spiritual path to discover, learn, think, and work hard all at once might be the greatest thing humanity has ever achieved.
Greater than the Great Wall of China?
If photographing the Great Wall of China from outer space is greater, then yes.
And one more thing, you implied an equation, Puritan equals religious zealot. I acknowledge that the trope exists, but it is false. Bacon was no zealot. Most Puritans were not zealots.
Okay, now back to the narrative on those monopolies Francis Bacon disliked. We covered the fact that the net economic benefit to the crown and monopolist was smaller than the economic loss to everyone else. A net negative. But only a few people were perceptive enough to realize that. Mainly what people could see was the injustice of people's livelihoods under attack, and the fact that the whole system was hard on the poor in particular. And here is cause 3. The king was the source of all this injustice, when his whole metaphysical point was to be a source of justice. The king did get some revenue, he thought, although we understand he lost possibly more due to the growth of unlicensed, read untaxed, trading. We mentioned the case of Ursula Hicks of Richmond, who managed to avoid fees for her 40-year career, and this was an example of felt injustice for what seemed like random requirements to pay licenses to monopolists. Why does she get away with it when I cannot? And that's what people call the chump effect nowadays. It's not only unjust, but I feel like a chump for paying. Anyway, by the way, I'm not saying Ursula was famous or anything. I only brought her up as a tribute to David Crowther. There were many Ursulas. She is one example. But at least the rich merchant companies supported him, right? No. I mean, even the East India Company, which kind of needed a monopoly to earn sufficient profits to keep up their own private army and navy out in India, were undermined when Charles sold the license to a second East India Company. One of the historical controversies about James I is the question of how much his private life was known outside the court. His homosexual side, which was considered a very bad thing in the early 17th century by a large part of society, drunkenness that could go on day and night for extended periods, which possibly explains his bouts of rage and anger, shouting at people, threatening them, because otherwise he seemed quite kindly. Once when he was told the people wanted to see his face, his response was, "I'll pull down my pants and show them my arse." There were insults and lewd behavior towards women by his court, lavish spending on fantastic parties with costumed dramas and elaborate staging. It used to be thought that few people outside the court knew about it, but the consensus seems to be now that pamphlet evidence indicates the king's lavish spending and various forms of low morals were pretty well known. And we have the Venetian ambassador saying that the king's behavior led to his being, quote, despised and almost hated, unquote. Another issue was the king's favorites, and these would certainly have been well known to the political nation. The first in England was Robert Carr. In 1607, Robert Carr was 21, and James seemed to really fall for him. Infatuated is a word you often see about James and Robert Carr. In addition to a title of nobility, James made him Earl Somerset. He lavished gold and jewels upon him. James went for handsome, tall men with athletic builds, but more than that, confident, with impeccable manners. Noble families tried, in pathetically obvious ways sometimes, to place pretty, effeminate young men in his path, and this always failed. But it does indicate a kind of shallow, naive attitude towards homosexuality that people seem to have at the time, at the baldric level of, what a cunning plan. Anyway, Carr was a Scotsman allied with the Howards. The Howards, that same noble family we keep running into, were actually being paid an annual pension by the Spanish, while also serving, in quotes, the English crown. Well, Carr wanted to marry a Howard. Her name was Frances, but she was already married to another big shot, the Earl of Essex. And she wanted to get an annulment from Essex on the grounds of his impotence. And the king agreed to help his favorite marry Frances Howard. And one of Carr's friends, a man named Overbury, was against this and was said to have a great secret against Francis. And supposedly Overbury was the real author of the love letters that Carr wrote to Francis. Oh, Cyrano. I warn you, this is going to get smutty. James tries to appoint Overbury to a trade mission to Moscow to get him out of the way. Overbury refuses the royal command, so James has him thrown in the Tower, where he is poisoned to death. Essex will not go along with the idea of divorce on grounds of impotence, for obvious enough reasons. So they come up with the idea he was not impotent at all. No, that was right out, just bewitched. The famous wood-softening spell, of course. The church objected, but James overruled them, and now Essex would go along since, it is now public knowledge he does have a working member. But was Frances in fact a virgin? The whole thing fails if she's not a virgin. So a commission of ladies gathers to examine her for signs of virginity. No, I am not kidding. This happened. The lady wore a veil the entire time, so many said a real virgin had been examined in her place. Anyway, because of witchcraft and virginity, the king's favorite and Francis Howard were allowed to wed. And you can imagine that this juicy affair would be the talk of England. Now, this is very reminiscent of Henry VIII, but James found a new favorite, George Villiers, also aged 21 or 22 at the time. And we know they often shared a bed because James wrote letters to that effect. We have these strange letters, very strange coming from a king. But keeping old lovers around when a new one is preferred is always problematic. Is that the ghost of Anne Boleyn I see? Is that the ghost of Anne Boleyn? Is that the ghost of Anne Boleyn? Especially since Carr objected loudly about Villiers taking his place. Carr was now inconvenient. So Overbury's death was discovered to be murder. Accomplices were found, testimony given, that added a whole new dramatic element. But shock and horror, it was discovered that Carr and Francis Howard poisoned Overbury in the Tower, and that Frances herself had been the witch that softened Essex's flagpole. They went down for murder, and the whole affair made it common news for people to talk about James and how he behaved with his favorites. That he had favorites, that he was one of those, not that there's anything wrong with it, of course.
Did he really have his old lover killed so that he could be with his new lover? That sounds like Henry VIII.
Few historians seem willing to say so, which I find strange. But here is another thing. James did not have Carr and Francis put to death. They were just locked up. He couldn't bring himself to order their deaths directly. But he did have all their accomplices, the common people involved, executed. So another one of those different laws for different social classes things that was very unpopular in England and much remarked upon. Another strike against the pillar of justice. He would eventually make his new favorite, George Villiers, the actual head of government, which seems like just about the most frivolous thing a king can do, right? And we'll pick it up here next week after conversations with Cammie.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
Well, thanks for coming on the program, Cammie, and you've had a chance to listen to episode 40 with Valkyrie as a returning guest and covered a bunch of the life of James Stuart. How do you react?
Well, it's great to hear from Valkyrie again. Always a pleasure to hear her voice. One quick note. Rosenborg Castle, the lion and the devouring the horse. Are you going to put pictures of that statue up on the website? I know we have a few.
Yeah, we need to get some pictures up. Yeah, that's a good idea.
You refer to it, and it is quite an amazing castle, and the horse has such amazing expressions, as does the lion.
Yeah.
I'm picturing it, but I know what you're talking about. I enjoyed learning more about James. He's quite the character. I mean, I had pictures in my mind of James already, but you've shown me a lot more here. His relationship with Anne sounds really quite unusual and interesting.
I don't know. I mean, his relationship with Anne kind of fades away pretty quick.
Well, yeah, but the story of the shipwreck and his basically going in to save her,
Yeah.
and the witches and the storm and the demons and his professing of love and not needing a dowry. It's all very kind of storybook.
Yeah, it is kind of. I mean, it is definitely this great romantic gesture.
It is, and 7 children. And then there's this other side to James.
Oh, but his son is going to repeat his grand romantic gesture, and it will not work out well.
Ah, well, I'll look forward to that story as well. But my curiosity was, okay, as they go forward, and he obviously has other favorites. Do we know much about his relationship going forward with Anne, or is he just having all these children to do his kingly duty?
I would say James enjoyed quiet domestic life also at times. When Anne dies, and she dies about late 16 teens, he kind of recreates a quiet domestic life with George Villiers' wife and mother, who also convert to Catholicism. So he has this kind of quiet domesticitude going on in the midst of everything else. But, I mean, that was a facet of his personality. He seemed to like that.
He almost seems to have a double life.
Well, I think almost all of us are a bit like that. We have a lot of different sides, a lot of different things that we like. There's a funny story about his solicitude for, I think it was one of Villiers' nieces, or maybe a younger sister, and James is asked to get a good marriage for her, and he sets her up with an elderly knight who's said to have a very large estate, but up until that time had never been known to love anything but boys. But at least he's elderly and would pass soon, I suppose. So that was considered a good marriage back in the day.
Marriage was looked at much differently than now. It was often family connections and property wealth.
Yep.
Passing on the name, and sometimes it was more about that than affection.
Yeah, often more about that than love.
So.
Although Alan Massey's point, which I thought was really interesting, is that young people in those situations try to sort of convince themselves to love the other. And they actually try to have a love match. And I thought, I don't know if that's true, but I thought that was an interesting psychological insight.
I think there's probably centuries of arranged marriages that would point to that. How did the people feel about him?
Well, so that's the thing I mentioned. It was quite controversial that for a long time, I think historians believed that it wasn't well known, that was a court thing, that was a political nation thing. He was, greatly disapproved of by the political nation, meaning, or just a fraction of the 10 to 20% that would be eligible to elect members to parliament. But pamphlet evidence now seems to indicate that maybe this was actually really well known, and that he might very well have been thought of as a drunkard and a libertine. But the other problem with interpreting pamphlet evidence like that is we don't know if people believed it, just because they heard it. Just because, somebody would read it to them down at the alehouse doesn't mean that they necessarily believed it. Or also, they may have really thought of the king as like another category of being for whom normal moral standards don't apply. That if your neighbor behaved that way, that might be one thing. But the king does it. It's, he's practically like God.
You discussed Puritans for a bit with Valkyrie.
Yeah, and we'll talk in future episodes. There's a psychology of Puritanism which I think people really need to understand. I think their ministers were superb psychologists in some ways. And unfortunately, they didn't psychological acumen on a scientific basis. because they kind of recognized the sort of multiple mindedness that humans are, and that voices and impulses. And they had crafted a whole way of, okay, this is how you listen to yourself. This is how you come to agreement. This is how you share that sort of discussion with others. And, I find the whole thing fascinating. And it's too bad they never systematized it, but it was widely taught and developed in England starting in about the 1590s. So that they worked on that for like 50 years, and they developed a middle-class Puritan public that believed they could separate out in the form of their conscience the voice of God from all the other voices, and how to negotiate with that voice, and how to share the output from that voice with others, and come to agreement with others over what God's will was. It made them really interesting, because when eventually they take power, they were quite good at it, because mostly they weren't that interested in wielding power, right? They had completely other priorities, which is really rare in the world.
It would be an unusual type setup and probably very curious.
Yeah, short-lived, but a really interesting time that saw a lot accomplished.
How long was that period of time?
Arguably from 1649 to 1659. Murderer. I want to thank Valkyrie for coming on the program. I think you really added some interesting ideas. And, of course, thank you, Cammie.
You're welcome.
Please click subscribe or follow on your podcast app. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend about it. If you don't, please tell an enemy.
If you're on Twitter X, go find me and give me a follow.
Thank you for listening.